This modern world of science and invention is of particular interest to women. Science. This modern world, science, particular interest to women. Science, women.
Hello, and welcome to AnthroChat, a University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee Department of Anthropology podcast series where anthropology students have topical discussions about all things anthropological. This AnthroChat's topic is Gender Matters in Archaeology, and joining me today are Kate Czarnezki, Crystal Morgan, and Jaclyn De Medicci. Kate is a PhD candidate under the supervision of Dr. Bettina Arnold. Her area of research involves nationalist appropriation of German prehistory, reception studies, and cultural memory. For her dissertation, she examines the figure of Thusnelda through an art historical and gendered lens. Crystal is in her second year of graduate school and is working towards a master's in anthropology, focusing on archaeology. Her thesis research uses geographic information systems to model the locations of potential lithic raw material sources in the Midwestern United States in order to understand the movements of ancient indigenous groups across the landscape. Her advisor is Dr. Jennifer Haas. Jaclyn is a PhD candidate under the supervision of Dr. Bettina Arnold. Her work focuses on cultural entanglement and expressions of identity through loom weights from Iron Age, Western, Sicilian, Elimoy, Greek, and Phoenician contexts. I'm your host, Ann Eberwein. Thank you for joining us. Now let's get to the AnthroChat and hear from our panelists. Okay, so I'd like to ask, when did you first become interested in anthropology, and what made you decide to focus on archaeology?
My name is Kate. I am a PhD candidate, and I have been interested in archaeology since I was really young. When I was 4, I was one of the kids that always liked ancient Egypt and all that kind of good stuff. And I had gone through the school system and always maintained an interest in history. I liked reading various history novels, historical fiction. Big fan of the Royal Diaries books. And then I entered my undergrad and was still kind of a history major, but became more exposed to anthropology through several different honors classes. And archaeology was always one of my interests in particular. And then I had the fortune to take some classes with who would later become my current master's and PhD advisor, Bettina Arnold. And that really just set the scene. I just really liked figuring out kind of why people work the way they work, but on a larger social scale. Always liked the material culture and learning about gender. So it was very serendipitous for me being able to pursue it, and various field experiences set me kind of down the path where I was thinking, yeah, this is really what I like and what I want to do.
Thank you, Kate. Jaclyn or Crystal, would you like to answer?
My name is Jaclyn, and I'm a PhD dissertator in archaeology. And mine goes back pretty far, like Kate as well. My father is a huge history buff, so never met a museum he didn't like. Roadside museums, major museums. So we were always going to things like that. And a lot of documentaries on the old public access channel. I'm a child of the 70s, so I'm not going to lie. Indiana Jones was huge. I was at that right age where I just thought it was the coolest thing ever. And it's really understanding and learning about those who came before, right? How did the world get to where it is now, and people and cultures? And archaeology just adds that physical aspect to see and touch and walk in the places that the people of the past have, or see the things they worked with or built, or just anything. It brings it that much more closer and gives real humanity to it. My path is a little different, maybe not so much, but my bachelor's and master's are in ancient history. Where I went to school didn't offer archaeology. So when I came back to school and UW-Milwaukee offered archaeology as a PhD program, I was incredibly excited, because I love history and people and the story of us, but I love the physical nature of the archaeological aspect.
All right, thanks, Jaclyn. How about you, Crystal?
Hi, I'm Crystal. I'm a master's student in archaeology. And my story is a little different. I didn't really grow up knowing about anthropology or archaeology. I always did enjoy history, but never really saw it as like a future degree that I could get or would get. And then when I got into college in undergrad, the very first semester, I decided I wanted to finish that social studies kind of social science requirement. And I knew I didn't want to do psychology, and it was kind of between anthropology and sociology. And anthropology just seemed a little bit more interesting, and I didn't know anything about it, and it fit my schedule. But after taking the class and like really getting into it and learning about what anthropology meant and how it was different from like history or sociology or psychology, I really loved it. I fell in love with it. And I went down, it became my first major in undergrad, and archaeology just kind of seemed like a natural progression for me. I didn't really want to do the cultural, and the biological was way too sciencey for my liking. So archaeology was kind of a really good middle ground. But like the idea of like digging up the past, whether or not you're actually digging in the dirt or just like digging into the stories of the people who couldn't, necessarily tell their own tales anymore, and that was always one of the things I didn't like about history, was that it was always written by the victors, right? It was always written by those who were in power. And archaeology seemed like a way to kind of get into the stories of those who maybe weren't the ones in power.
Thank you to all three of you. Those are really interesting answers. My next question, and Kate, I think you already touched on this a little bit, mentioning Bettina Arnold, who's also my advisor, and I think Jaclyn's advisor too. So my next question is there a woman or several women who inspired you to become an archaeologist or inspired you in your academic pursuits?
I can continue with that right away. So, as you had said and alluded to, Dr. Bettina Arnold was definitely and remains an inspiration for me. Seeing an archaeologist and historian with such an immense academic output was always something that I had really admired. I remember even in undergrad, like looking at her CV and just seeing like all the articles and all the chapters that had been written, and how she really like opened the door for talking about nationalism and archaeology and the ways that archaeology can be used in terms of government and then various interests in terms of gender, and really to me cemented that, wow, this is a field that has so many different implications and applications that you don't necessarily think about. So like we talked about Indiana Jones, right? So you watch the movies, you think, oh, the Nazis are the bad guys, but not right away do you think about, were they actually conducting archaeology? And they were, right? So that was something else that became very influential to me in terms of, okay, this is happening in film, this is happening just in all these different spots. So, and then also how she had really brought together different points in terms of gender education, gender seminars at UWM, and then being a part of the Chacmo conference. So there's just a lot where you can see that the field needs to go forward for having women in archaeology, and not just women, but people of different gender identities pressing forward with queer archaeology. And it's really kind of an honor to work with a professor that had gotten that ball rolling.
So I started my undergrad like 25 years ago, and women's studies was brand new at the university I was at. And it wasn't even a major. It was called women's studies, first of all, and it was only a minor or a certification. And I ended up just happened to get a job, a campus job, working at desk in that department. And the professors in that department really kind of opened my eyes to a whole new way of looking at things. And it was very cross-departmental, right? So it wasn't just women's studies on its own. It was, cross-referenced with the history department, with social sciences, with so many different things. And it was just through my exposure to those professors and then started taking some of their classes and things like that, that I said, I really want to continue to study what I'm studying, but through this more critical lens. So they really started me on this path. And I was very lucky that Bettina Arnold was the one that gave me the opportunity at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And I had read her CV, but I didn't know a whole lot because, again, my background at that point wasn't in archaeological specific research. And she's been such an inspiration, and I'm so thrilled and fortunate to be able to learn and research under her.
I think that that's one of the really great things about Bettina is that she is so encouraging of her students in terms of their research pursuits. Crystal, did you want to talk about this? Or if not, we can move on to another question.
Yeah, I can talk about it. I think I'm the only one who's not one of Dr. Arnold's advisees in this group, but I actually, when I first looked at UWM, I think I came across Dr. Arnold's CV and works and everything that she's done as far as gender studies, and also with her other Neolithic Europe and the beer brewing. And I think I was on a bus in field school down in Illinois when I came across her profile and everything. It's I think I'm in love. Just with the whole everything that she presents and everything. And I've had the honor of having some classes with her. So being able to have someone like that at UW Milwaukee to be able to look up to as a female has been a tremendous plus to being here at UW Milwaukee. As far as before I came here, I didn't really have any females that influenced me to go into archaeology, but as far as my academic pursuits, one of the first ones I remember is my high school English teacher. She was this petite lady, but you did not cross her, but she expected so much out of all of her students. It was kind of like a Bettina to me. She was very much like a Dr. Arnold to me at that time. And to this day, I think I'm still trying to figure out how to rewrite my senior paper for her class because I think I disappointed her. But I mean, that's what you want. You want someone who is going to push you and encourage you to keep going.
So kind of moving on to, we'll get back to another of Bettina's contributions later, but another segment that I want to talk about is sort of the history of women archaeologists, the history of women in archaeology. And I guess my first question for all of you is, who is it that comes to mind when you think about the history of women in archaeology? Is there one specific archaeologist? Are there many? Obviously, Mary Leakey is sort of paleoanthropology, but still, that's someone who always comes to mind.
Yeah, I was definitely going to say Mary Leakey. She's obviously the first one that comes to my mind, and she's very public, right? Especially with all the work she's done in Olduvai Gorge. And I think one of the things that you do see with Mary Leakey a lot, though, is that she's always in reference with her husband. It's always Mary and Louis Leakey. It's not just her and what she specifically has done for the field. But she's still someone that, you think about.
I think Agatha Christie is an interesting figure to look at in terms of the history of archaeology and anthropology. We do sometimes see her being compared with her husband, the archaeologist Max Mallowan, but her work in terms of literature makes her name stand out a little bit more than what we would think of. So she kind of pioneered some of the filming and photographing of archaeological excavations and digs, but it's also important to put her work in context and along with the work of her husband, where it is the 1930s, the early 1900s. So you're seeing a very Orientalist perspective. So it's a period of colonial anthropology, a period of colonial archaeology, right? So the way of where you look at how can we talk about what this person contributes, but not only in a positive, but also potentially a negative, right? So she's a very complex figure that I think is kind of worth analyzing from historical and in a intersectional manner, and what may have been beneficial, what may have caused harm, etc.
That's really interesting. I'm glad you brought that up.
I just wanted to add, kind of in the Milwaukee or Midwest area, Alice Kehoe has been a pretty prominent female archaeologist. I've had the opportunity to sit on a couple of her presentations. She fought at Marquette for women's rights to teach and get a fair wage. And so I think, her work is pretty important. So, and then I don't know if anyone has seen, there's like a movie coming out about Ann Axtell Morris down in Southwest United States, and like her work that she did and like everything that she kind of perpetuated down in like Southwestern archaeology. And that's like a newer thing. Like she wasn't really known about because of the overshadowing of her husband, archaeologist. And so there's a movie coming out that focuses really on her and her work, her relationship with her husband, and like the relationship that they both had with the indigenous groups down in Southwestern, like Arizona, New Mexico area of the United States. So I thought that was really, really cool.
There's another individual too that I think merits conversation, Sally Binford, almost completely unheard of. I mean, we know about her a little bit in terms of the history and archaeology that's being taught, but almost entirely within feminist archaeology classes. I have never heard her once mentioned in connection to being the co-founder of processual archaeology due to the dominance of her then husband, Louis Binford. I believe they were divorced, but she became a very pivotal person in terms of kind of formulating the processual movement, and then later on feminist archaeology, that kind of 70s, 80s first wave in terms of the field that we have, becomes later associated with first wave of feminist archaeology, I should say, not the first wave of feminism, that becomes associated later with Conkey and Spector. I think I remember hearing her referenced as kind of a Binford debate, but she never tends to be the person that's published in archaeological textbooks. It's almost always her husband, Louis.
In general, in your archaeology classes, how is the history of women in archaeology presented? And then as you continued pursuing archaeology, was that initial portrayal that was given to you, did you determine that that was accurate, through additional pursuits, additional reading, or was that something that maybe was misportrayed?
I was spoiled because I did my undergrad here at UWM. I had a fantastic instructor into archaeology, Marcus Schulenberg. He incorporated in that kind of in our unit right away something on gender, tried to reach gender throughout, so that it wasn't like a chapter that you just get shoehorned in, as Bettina's fond of saying, add women and stir. He didn't do that. So he would make sure to include various gender roles throughout. And then, of course, I was spoiled by taking classes with Dr. Arnold, who always made the effort to be inclusive and talk about the history of women. Most of the classes I took were very seminar based, and if there were more methods classes, I don't necessarily feel that gender was excluded. It was more so you're concentrating on techniques. So it's not like men were really talked about in that case. It's more like, okay, this is how you flint knap. And that's kind of what it was about. And then, of course, as you continue on, I took more gender-based seminar and other types of social classes moving forward. So I was pretty lucky to have an inclusive education.
Thanks, Kate. Jaclyn and Crystal, do either of you want to comment on this? I think, Jaclyn, you said you're a child of the 70s, so you might have had a different sort of way that was portrayed, but I guess you also said you're coming from outside of archaeology. So I'm curious to see what you...
Right, but I'd still comment on it. So I did my undergrad and master's, 2 decades ago. And my path was ancient history, not archaeology at that time. But I think there's a lot of correlation between what I was seeing. So the regular standard historical courses were what kind of you would expect at that time. It was very male based, women as passive, and it was only in the labeled women's studies classes or cross-listed women's studies, that they'd be discussed in any other light other than like passive actors as history happened to them. So when I came to the university here in Milwaukee, I could see how much time had moved forward the conversation since I had last been in it, right? My experience was much like Kate's. The classes I was in, they were seminar-based, mostly focused on conversations that, if not focused on women, at least evened out the playing field as to what the focus was, or pointed out what we need to be aware of, where the stereotypes are, what the ingrained assumptions, to be more aware of how we're thinking and understanding context. So it's, from my perspective, it's been really interesting to see where gender studies has gone in the last 20 years in a university setting. So my overall experiences have been positive. Maybe not so much at some of my undergrad level classes when I think stereotypes were a little more common. And I went to University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, so it's definitely also not as, at that time, as, I don't want to say liberal, but kind of liberal as a Madison or Milwaukee at that time.
It's great to have your perspective on that. Crystal, would you like to chime in on this as well?
Yeah, so my undergrad, not only was it like a decade ago, so it was like the mid 2000s to 2010s is when I did my undergrad. And so I was trying to like ponder and remember what my classes were like. I didn't stay in anthropology the entire time. I ended up getting a minor. So I didn't have as many classes in there. I ended up going to history and then hospitality. So but yeah, I don't really remember any of the classes really having a focus on women. I don't really remember there being a women's studies or gender studies like class that was available. Most of the professors were male. The couple that were female were like more adjunct. They weren't tenure, and they were actually on the cultural side of it, if I remember correctly. They weren't on the archaeological or even biological side of things. And then I was kind of correlating that to my time in hospitality, so restaurants and hotels. And it was kind of a very similar eerie feeling that you have all these female students being taught by men. And then you go into the field, you go into like working, and it's usually men in the higher positions still, but you still have all these females kind of coming through this like, and yet we're not being talked about in the classes themselves. Like the history of our roles within the discipline isn't being talked about. And so not only did I do that like 10 years ago, but it was also down in Florida. So much different political atmosphere down there. So I'm wondering if like the idea of not having really women's studies or being prominent could have been part of that as well. And then coming to UW Milwaukee, there has been a lot more discussion. Just seeing that difference in the 10 or so years has been fantastic to be able to see a syllabus of readings and have women be included, even if it's not specifically on gender studies, and then having like a whole section of the class being discussed on gender studies, I think is a good stepping stone, even if, it's not ideal that it's still kind of this box, right? It's still a box within the lesson that we're getting pushed, but still it's happening. So that was a really cool thing to see happen coming here.
I guess one sort of additional question, not specifically about academia, but sort of in general about the way that anthropology and archaeology struggle with their representation of women and minorities. What do you think about this? Do you have thoughts on this?
Yes, this is a social issue. It's not exclusive to anthropology or archaeology. Under the field of reception studies, that it was pioneered in classics and antiquity. What happens is that popular culture or culture in general affects people's perceptions of reality, right? So like a great example is the fact that Vikings didn't wear horned helmets, but there's this popular perception that Vikings wore horned helmets because of the work by individuals such as Richard Wagner, various kind of artists that happened during the Romantic era and later 1870s. So, because of this, women tend to get discarded. And I believe in the book that we had been sent, Gender Stereotypes in Archaeology, a short reflection in image and text, right? So they talk about a lot how women tend to have this passive social role. They're very much removed in these portrayals that we have. And right, so like it becomes a sense where almost life informs art, but life ends up imitating art in a way, right? Because this is just the perception that we continually have. It's speaks to the importance of why we need to have representation, right? You can do this. This needs to be presented in a certain way. So when we look at female figures and how they end up being shown in TV, right, we seem to see two different kinds of iterations. You either have someone that is very passive, very, quote unquote, socially traditionally feminine. Maybe they are a victim, whether it's various types of analogies or they're, either kind of like a archetypal mother figure or something. Or you have these figures that you denote as quote unquote strong female characters, but what makes them strong, right? What makes them strong in this sense of popular imagery, popular media, is that they have these masculine traits that we've deemed socially, right? So like, ideally you'd have a middle ground, right? Like why can't you have, a mother and a warrior, someone that may be feminine, someone that may not be feminine, but they tend to be these almost like dichotomous images that happen, whether it's film, whether it's in books, and you lose complexity, right? So like the strong female warrior character, you have no idea who this person is outside of that identity. So, that's something that we have to think about when you are portraying women, whether it's women in the past or women archaeologists, like who is this person?
Yeah, and to just kind of play on what Kate was saying, an example would be, I don't know if anyone has seen the movie The Dig. It recently came out a few years ago. We'll just say a few years ago. And the female archaeologist, I think her name is Peggy Piggott, and how she is portrayed in the movie as being this like very petite, passive woman married to one of the other archaeologists that are come on there, and how she is just there because she's light enough and small enough to be able to dig in this very sensitive area, right? They don't want anyone kind of crushing down the ribs of this boat impression. And there's this whole like storyline implanted that she's not happy with her marriage. And so she, not to try to ruin this for anybody, but she's not happy with her marriage. There's this other archaeologist there, person there that like she ends up cheating on her husband with. And it's like, that didn't happen. Like that, they had to make up some sort of like storyline to give her a love interest when, they could have just portrayed her as being this very smart female archaeologist, whether or not she was chosen for her light physique or whatever, like she went on and she's done amazing things since then, but that's not discussed. It's not even like touched upon in the movie. It's just, she's this very passive female who is only there to fulfill a plot hole.
I refuse to watch that movie, actually. So many people reached out and said, oh, have you seen this new movie coming out? And first of all, I don't like love stories, or that's not the kind of movies. And just based on the trailers, and you're just reinforcing every reason why I wanted to avoid it, because that's exactly what I feared its portrayal will be. So it's interesting you bring that up, and I'm stand by my decision to never watch it. But I would agree with everything Kate and Crystal said. And in my experience, either for modern women archaeologists, like all the people in this meeting right now, what I've seen is you're either, the plucky love interest female archaeologist, right? Or you are the more masculine presenting serious archaeologist. And there's no middle ground. There's no recognition of uniqueness of character or likes or dislikes, or, you're either one or the other, and there's no shades of individuality or personality. And like, I can't tell you how many times when I've spoken with various people and I tell them what I'm studying and what I do, and they are surprised that I would be willing to dig in the dirt because I'm very, very female, feminine presenting. And it's always a little slap in the face when they kind of laugh and make those kind of comments, because it's like, you don't, because you think I don't want to get dirty, or, it's very demoralizing for something you're very passionate and excited about to be kind of backhanded with that. I wouldn't think you want to get dirty, and just reduced in that way.
I wanted to add to what Crystal was saying about the dig, because we have the Bechdel test, which is, are there more than one women in a movie, and do they have a conversation about something not related to men? And there is a conversation between Peggy Piggott and Edith Pretty, who's the landowner of the area where they're doing the excavation in the movie. And they have one conversation where they talk about the best clothing to wear out in the field. So I would say it just barely scrapes by with the Bechdel test, or maybe it just fails completely. I also wanted to go back to something that Kate said earlier, because you were talking about the way life influences art, and then art also influences life. And I think that's really important in terms of all these different ways that archaeology is portrayed, whether it's in a textbook or a classroom or in a movie or in a museum, is that there's sort of ways that women are portrayed so that we can actually see that and make that choice and be that in our careers.
Yeah, so just kind of like the portrayal of women in like media, especially, there's like that lack of portrayal too. And I remember, I think it was last semester, I was tabling for the Anthropology Student Union here at UW Milwaukee, and a guy comes up to me. He's like, "I'm not in anthropology. I'm writing a book on an archaeologist who goes to, I think it was University of Chicago or something like that, and he is this great archaeologist student, and he's going to save the world." And so I asked him, like, why did you choose this character, and why that person, why this school, just trying to get some more information. He's like, well, Indiana Jones, right? Like, he is the epitome of an archaeologist and what everything an archaeologist has to be. And so it's like, not only is there this like issue of the portrayal of women in archaeology, but just the portrayal of archaeologists in general in the media. And, the fact that he was using Indiana Jones as a like ultimate, savior person for some, I don't even remember exactly what it was. And I mentioned, like, why not make it a female? And he's like, no, that's not possible. And it's like, okay, cool. I was like, well, I think you're going to have a lot of pushback, because we're really trying to get away from the idea of Indiana Jones as archaeologist, and maybe do a little bit more research on like the current themes in archaeology before you publish this. He's like, okay, well, let me know if you can find someone who could talk to me. And I was like, all right, bye.
I think we also have to comment on what we know as one of our more famous female archaeologists, right? Laura Croft, and how she's portrayed. Very over-sexualized character. If I recall from my video game history knowledge, the way she looks is the reason why she looks the way she looks, right? She has very large breasts, is because they had made a mistake animating it. And then whoever was supervising was like, oh, I love that, let's keep it. So this is what we're kind of jutting up against, right? So someone, and like Indiana Jones, in the sense of, they don't have a problem carrying a gun, they don't have a problem taking items and just looting them there, and not actually conducting what an archaeological excavation would be. There's themes of supernatural, but she's one of the only like quote unquote popular media individuals that I can think of that's a woman in archaeology.
So I guess moving on from there, we can talk about the gender stereotypes in archaeology, a short reflection in image and text publication from Sidestone Press, which Bettina Arnold and Alice Kehoe both contributed to. And I think I asked each of you to pick out, I guess, the stereotype that's most interesting to you, or if you'd like to talk about the stereotypes in general. I think there's 24 stereotypes. And I should mention this publication is free to download from Sidestone Press.
So I had chosen gender is universal. And I think that's one of the more difficult concepts for Western minds to wrap their heads around. And case in point, a little anecdotal evidence. At the dinner table the other night, we were talking about gender and pronouns and everything with my husband and two youngest children. And I was trying to explain that what we understand as gender is a construct, and it's not always been how we perceive it today. And I was mentioning, like Native American tribes had a third gender, and it was totally normal for that culture, and even how it's shifted within our own culture over the years, right? What's male, what's female. And their minds were blown. They had no idea that it wasn't always how we perceive it in every culture throughout time ever. And just the idea that it may not mean the same thing to different people, different cultures, different times and places you could see the wheels turning, right? It was just a real moment, and it generated a lot more discussion after that. Gender being universal, I think if you start from the premise that it is universal, and any research or analysis or conclusions you're going to draw are going to be inherently flawed. And I think Bettina's work is a good example of that. Her entire body of work is challenging, not entire body, but you know what I mean? It challenges that precept that it's a universal thing, and you can only interpret things based against the measurement of our interpretation.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things to me in Bettina's research, and that she talked about in a gender archaeology seminar, is just the fluidity of gender over the course of a person's life in Iron Age Europe, for example. So I think that's a really great point.
There's so many to pick from. I think one of them that relates really particularly to my work was that all women are young, slim, and beautiful in the past versus all men are young, tall, and athletic in the past. So what I research is this individual named Thusnelda that may or may not have existed. She's referenced by Tacitus as the wife of Arminius or Herman, who was a Germanic chieftain that stood up against the Romans at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. So he had been trained as a Roman soldier and therefore kind of had insider knowledge and was able to defeat like 3 Roman legions, uniting Cherusci and other Germanic tribes. But so his wife was referenced by Strabo and by Tacitus and becomes this figure later on in German nationalism. And she's again a figure now in a Netflix adaptation of the events of Teutoburg Forest called Barbarians. It came out, I think, in 2020, and there was a 2022 or 2023 second season that was renewed. And the actress they have for her, she is extremely beautiful. She's a French-German model. She's tiny. She's real tiny, and not the type of person that I would envision being fighting in this battle that is being conducted. It's very, I think one of the terms that's one of my favorites from women in media studies is a waifu, not waifu, but like waif. That's it. Waifu, where it's this like 90-pound soaking wet person. Summer Glau often gets put in this role, right, for like the Terminator, that is somehow able to incapacitate a whole room of warriors. And it's very kind of a male gaze-esque idea where, you know, they have no visible muscle tone. Have they ever trained as a warrior ever in the past? No. But somehow they're able to be, you know, picking up the sword or picking up an axe and just brandishing it. You know, I have not seen many individuals in media that are female warriors that have, you know, a lot of muscle tone, right? So there just tends not to be this. It's very much this kind of smaller person that maybe they're training and maybe that they're doing this, but it's a disconnect from when you look at female MMA fighters, right? Or various different types of female athletes, or like the US Olympic team, right? Like people are pretty muscular, people are pretty active. So just this like reimagining of this kind of like romantic era, soft tone woman, like those Waterhouse paintings as well. And then men have this kind of, they can either be like very Greco-Roman-esque youth, or like Spartacus, and or the 300 movies, right? Leonidas, right? So they're just these really muscular looking men, or they're very elderly, right? But we don't have people that are just walking around that have, normal amounts of body fat, people that are walking around maybe balding, or just, kind of are living their everyday life. It's this very like glamorized, idealized version of the past that gets presented forward, whether it's in print media or television or movies.
I was going to say, it's interesting when you do find a woman that is more muscular in media, they're usually like brought down, like, oh, she's too masculine, like she's too, like, I'm not attracted to her, and so she's often brought down to not be this ideal woman. So it's, even when you do get that, because I remember, I think with Fast and Furious, Michelle Rodriguez, she was a little bit more muscular of a woman compared to some of the other ones in the movie. And I remember hearing guys around me just being like, oh, I didn't like her. Like she was too buff for me. And it's just like, okay.
And there's exclusion of women in larger bodies, right? So like we know that what beauty standards were for Renaissance women, or beauty standards were for pre-French Revolution Rococo France, right? It's larger bodies. But if you go and you decide to watch like a show like Versailles, I mean, the women that are in there are probably size zeros, right? So they're very bird-like. You lose the reality of the time period, which was the standard of beauty is having a larger body.
These are such great points. And I think it's interesting because we do have some archaeological evidence in terms of belts that are a certain length, I think, that suggests that people had larger waists, or women had larger waists.
So mine actually follows up on Kate's, because I had chosen only men were violent in past societies. And it kind of plays into this kind of same thing of like women were tiny or whatever, but more so, I think people have a hard time seeing women in leadership type roles because they can't be violent, right? They're too passive. They, can't make those harsh decisions. There's a lot of talk nowadays that in politics, like if a woman gets into office, like her emotions will come into play and she won't be able to handle it. They're just too emotional. But, we have these figures from past societies like Queen Boudica and Cleopatra, who were cunning, they were skillful, they were violent, in their own ways, whether that was physically or mentally. And it was just like, women can be violent. We're not just one note. But on the other hand of that is like, not all men were also violent, but then they would use these terms to denigrate men by using female or passive tones, right? Like, oh, you're too much of a wuss, or, a worse word for that. But like, there's these like demasculinizing ways to demasculinize men by using female terms, because that, is weaker or whatever. And it's just, women can be strong. They can, they can lead and be powerful. And I think that's more what this article is trying to say, not necessarily like they can be more violent, but we can, hold those similar roles that men do.
Yeah, thank you. So we're coming to my final question here. And I think this is my most difficult question to answer, because my question is, how can we be proactive in reducing the tendency of people to stereotype the past? And I mean, this publication is one example, but what are some other ways?
So I think one way for me is media. We do have portrayals in media of women or lack of women. I'm very hopeful for this new movie of Ann Eberwein. It's supposed to be portraying her in a very positive light, not only as a female, but with Indigenous relations. And so something like that, I think, is a really good step forward of really trying to figure out, how women have really contributed to the field of archaeology, and, having classes within universities, whether it's inside of the anthropology department or outside of it. Like, I think even here at UW Milwaukee, there is an honors class that people can take that is in relations to gender studies. So things like that, where it's not just in anthropology, that other students can have access to that as well, and becoming part of those core curriculums for students, and then just other outreach type things, and not having this idea that women can't be in the field, we can't be doing archaeology, we're not contributing anything, and having just women being more prolific in the readings that we do, whether it's for our own projects or in classes.
And I think being precise in the questions that we ask as destabilizing questions, I think to borrow from Alison Wiley, right? Like, why study gender? What is gender's biggest contribution or kind of helpfulness as a framework in an archaeological lens, right? So, you always hear the question, what's the point? Like, can we really know like about what it is in the past or whatnot? And one of the ways that you look at it is that you are destabilizing these assumptions that you think are inherent. And I think one of the good ways to kind of get at that and combat the assumed stereotypes or assumptions that we have about the past or portrayals, and this extends, of course, beyond just women, is not hesitating to ask, well, why would you think that? Or can you think of an example from your own life where this may be something that you find that's different? One of the ways you'll see this portrayed in terms of like ancient aliens, the idea like, oh, how could they do something like that, right? Like, how could you draw a perfect circle? And you can ask someone, well, do you know how you would draw a perfect circle? All you need is a stick and a string. So kind of like bringing in that Fader-esque, combating the notion of that people can't do something with, well, what do you do? Like, how can we think about different ways that this could be approached or whatnot? And even, there's relational analogies that you can bring up, even in contexts that we encounter very often in a Western society, right? So there's Judeo-Christian examples. There's just very aspects of, female heroes that we have in history that are great counters to the assumptions that we make.
For me, I would say just constant awareness and kind of self-monitoring, that we aren't defaulting to continuation of certain assumptions. And it's really hard to do, to step outside of what's so heavily ingrained in you as the culture you grew up in, right? So constantly self-checking, like, did I consider this from any other possible aspect or explanation or reason, or am I automatically just defaulting to stereotypes? And ensuring that any work that we're putting out is as, unbiased, non-conformist, as possible. And we'll reach a tipping point where everything that's out there is more normal, and it's not so. We're already seeing it over the last few decades in academia, where it's not such a compartmentalized area and way of studying things through the gendered lens, but that it's just part of the body of knowledge out there, and it becomes the normal thing, right? It's not the unique side study aspect of what's considered the normal thing. That makes sense?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that Bettina talks about. She refers to it as sort of ghettoizing gender studies, where you sort of take gender studies or women's studies and put it over here, and it is a separate thing. I want to thank you all so much for being here today. So thank you, Kate. Thank you, Jaclyn. Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you, Anne, for putting this together. This was awesome.
This modern world of science and invention is of particular interest to women. Science. This modern world, science, particular interest to women. Science and women.